Thank you all for joining us. I'm Aaron Dorfman, Executive Director of A More Perfect Union. We're recording this conversation just days after the 5-year anniversary of January 6th, a moment that continues to shape how Americans think about democracy, political conflict, and the risks of political violence. And we're doing so as we head into yet another high-stakes election year. Recently, we've seen a troubling pattern emerge: assassination attempts against a presidential candidate, the murder of lawmakers in Minnesota, escalating threats against members of Congress, doxing and swatting of election officials, arson and attempted murder against a sitting governor and his family, and other acts of violence against public figures across the ideological spectrum. These incidents are not isolated. They're part of a broader trend in which political violence is becoming more prevalent and at times dangerously normalized. At A More Perfect Union, we approach moments like this grounded in our democracy principles, particularly our absolute rejection of political violence, our commitment to pluralism, and our belief that democracy only works when we resolve our differences without threats, intimidation, or harm. As Jews, we also bring a particular lens to this conversation. Jewish history teaches us painfully and clearly that political violence and anti-Semitism often rise together, fueled by the same extremism and conspiratorial thinking. At the same time, Jewish tradition offers us powerful alternatives to violent conflict. Throughout Jewish text and history, our leaders and teachers have warned us against the allure of black and white thinking in the face of complex problems. We're taught to embrace and celebrate viewpoint diversity and productive disagreement, not to pursue scorched earth, winner-take-all victories over our political opponents. The work of living together in diverse communities is hard, but we're up for it. Today's conversation is not about doom and gloom predictions or partisan blame. It's about clarity, responsibility, and possibility. Political violence is being driven by the extremes, not by the overwhelming majority of Americans who are capable of finding common ground with each other and who seek to live peacefully with one another. And that distinction matters. I'm joined today by two leaders who bring different experiences but a shared commitment to democratic norms and public service. Kathy Boockvar, former Secretary of State of Pennsylvania, and Seth Bluestein, the City Commissioner of Philadelphia. Together, we'll talk about what's driving political violence, how anti-Semitism fits into this landscape, and most importantly, what Jewish leaders and institutions can do right now to help lower the temperature in their own communities. Kathy and Seth, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today. Let's begin by grounding ourselves in what we're seeing. From where each of you sit, what has changed over the past several years when it comes to political violence and threats against public servants? What feels different now than it did a decade ago? Seth, we'll start with you.
Well, first, let me just say thank you so much for having me as a part of this conversation. It's been a very challenging 5 to 6 years. In my role as city commissioner, and prior to this as the deputy commissioner in Philadelphia, it's our job to run the elections for the city of Philadelphia. It's our job to make sure that every single Philadelphian's voice is heard. And that has become more difficult over time from when we first started. And, for me, a lot of this goes back to the lead up to the 2020 election and has continued since then. It's a lack of trust in institutions. It's a lack of faith in each other. And a lot of that is driving this narrative and this direction of political violence and has caused a real problem for our democracy.
Kathy, how about you?
Yeah, and again, thanks, Aaron, for having us. It's an important conversation. Look, Seth and I have been working together since really 2018, and so much has changed since that time. And look, election officials are strong, tough people. We are not shy for the most part. We are nerds, but we're not shy. We care about the details. We're strong. We understand that inevitably in what we do, there are always people who are unhappy with the results of every single election, right? So it used to be that people, it's not like it's new that people would express discontent after an election. What changed starting in 2020, as Seth mentioned, is how how it's expressed and also the extreme degree. And instead of it being people just expressing discontent about the results of an election, they started to be really expressing intimidation, threats, violence, and it started, like, the numbers of people who were doing it was off the charts. And and what it really, to me, it came down to sort of the intersection of three different things that started in 2021. Of course, was the global pandemic, right? So it was already going to be a tense election in 2020, but the pandemic, the stresses of the pandemic, people dying, people losing their jobs, and our entire communities on lockdowns just exacerbated the stress. So the stress was higher. And then there's these, right? The phones, which are attached to our hips and are such a, like, the speed through which things can spread, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, just is off the charts. And then you also had people in positions of power who were encouraging the threats, the intimidation, the expressions of discontent is the nice way to say it, right? So the convergence of those things created a situation where people just frankly lost their minds and started threatening election officials. And in 2020, at the end of 2020, I remember engaging in a conversation with a couple of other secretaries of state where one of them said, well, hopefully this will all be done by Thanksgiving. And of course, none of us would have ever imagined that it's actually worse today than it was then.
Yeah. Kathy, let me a quick follow-up. How did it change? How did that threat environment change the way that election officials do their jobs?
I mean, in so many ways, and election officials, we use the word resilience a lot because our jobs have changed dramatically over, far more than the last 10 years. But like, you look at the last 10 years, first, we had to become experts in cybersecurity when it sort of became, this first global and then also domestic efforts to infiltrate our cyber systems. But then the threats and intimidation and violence have created this whole new need for us to become experts in physical security. And of course, look, the cybersecurity threats were immensely critical, but the physical security threats add a human dimension to it, right? You're not only worried about your own safety, but what about all your workers and the poll workers and the voters, right? So it's required us to, make sure that we have assessments of our physical security. And I'm sure Seth can talk about all of this stuff. Thankfully, we've built partnerships, cross-sector partnerships with law enforcement and emergency management. We've got organizations like the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections who were created specifically to help build those cross-sector partnerships so we make sure that we are enabling election officials and law enforcement to help protect election workers and voters alike. So it's been just an immense add to the burden of election officials.
Yeah, totally appreciate that. And Seth, one thing I wanted to follow up with you on, you talked about how trust in institutions has eroded. And I'm curious about from the perspective of local government, how does the threat of political violence coupled with that and kind of fed by that lack of trust in institutions show up at the community level and affect local institutions?
Well, what we're seeing is individuals who don't believe the results of the elections unless the result goes the way they want it to. And we're seeing that at the local level when we're interacting with members of the public or community leaders or political ward leaders or elected officials. They have a lot of questions, and sometimes they are legitimate questions where they want to understand the process better. And it's our job to be transparent and share as much as we can to educate the public. But then sometimes their questions are informed by mis and disinformation, and they don't want to hear the true answers. They want to believe what they're hearing from other places. A great example of this is the 2000 Mules video. And when I had an individual who I've known for a long time, involved in local politics, and he saw that video and immediately believed it and started asking me all these leading questions about our drop boxes and the ballots in Philadelphia in 2020. And when I responded to each of those points, he took them and understood what I was saying, but at the end of the day, believed the video more than he believed me. And this is someone I've known for years. So it has real impacts on relationships in the community and how we're trying to build trust in our elections and also get people to turn out and participate, because people are also less likely to participate in elections that they don't trust.
For sure. And I think part of what the reference to 2000 Mules also raises another question, which is, even if you're successful in debunking that mis and disinformation, the work you have to do, right, the drain on resources for election officials and the frontline workers that you represent, to have to respond to all of that, I feel like is a kind of a hidden cost that all of us are bearing. Okay, I want to pivot a little bit to intersecting what we've been talking about with the Jewish community and some Jewish questions in particular. Many of the extremist spaces that fuel political violence are also deeply saturated with anti-Semitism. Recent research from the ADL and the University of Chicago reveals an alarming correlation between anti-Semitic worldviews and the embrace of political violence. According to a study of about 8,000 U.S. adults, highly anti-Semitic individuals, people who accept lots of different anti-Jewish tropes, are 3 times more likely to support political violence compared to the general population. So how do you see anti-Semitism intersecting with political extremism and violence today? Kathy, I want to start with you on this.
It's so hard in most cases to even separate where one ends and the other begins. And I look at so much of it just comes down to, it's all about the other, right? And people are looking for blame and division and stereotypes across the board. And frankly, our leaders are encouraging that, are pointing the finger, are with accusatory, not only at individuals, right, but groups of individuals. And look, Russians have understood this dynamic for decades. And we look back at 2016 and 2018, when Russians saw that there were issues, that there were divides about Black Lives Matter. So they created false sites that looked like they were American sites to fuel the anti-BLM, efforts. And now it's not just the Russians, right? It's our homegrown operatives who have both political and monetary incentives because they make money on fueling this hate, right? And in the threats and intimidation that I received, it was all intertwined. And so, when the threat says, "Die, you traitorous hook-nosed whore," there's misogyny, there's anti-Semitism, there's that political extremism, and it's very scary. It's become completely. I can't even tell you how many of those kinds of comments I got, my mother got, my daughter got, all because of the work that I did. And a lot of it is, they don't necessarily say, you're a Jewish person that I'm targeting, right? They say, frizzy hair, cheater. They put echoes around your name on social media, right? Which is a dog whistle. A lot of people have no idea what those parentheses, the echoes mean, because it's a dog whistle. And I can tell you that anti-Semites and neo-Nazis and extremists understand very well that means that person's a Jew, and I want to make sure that you understand. People sent me, I got a religious emblem sent to me in the mail with just one phrase on it, which said, "Pray for protection." Like, there was some clear messaging that related to my religion, but again, intertwined with the threats and the misogyny all together.
Yeah. Seth, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, we experienced this personally in 2020 and 2024. And Kathy's right. For me, at least in 2020, it was intertwined very closely with the threats that we received. And yeah, they're not explicitly saying this Jewish person, but they're implying it in certain ways. They're leaning into these tropes of Jews running the world and running things and being in charge. So when you are an election official who's managing elections, it makes you an easy target from that perspective because it feeds into their ideas of Jews running things. And when people ask me about my experience in 2024, what I always say is, well, I had 100% fewer death threats, but an increase of anti-Semitism by like 500%. And you can just see how the entire online environment and social media right now, over the last 5 years, has gotten more and more anti-Semitic since 2020. It's been a very challenging environment.
And this is a question for both of you. Like, I think, Kathy, you alluded to a little bit, like that it's part of a toolkit for extremists to attack people, right? Whether it's attacking BLM because it's representative of people of color, marginalized community, whether it's attacking women, whether it's attacking Jews. But I'm curious about why you think Jews are so often targeted and scapegoated in moments of acute political instability like we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think part of it is, what are we, 2.5% of the US population? And yet, to Seth's point, there's a perception of that we're in positions of power. And many in the United States have literally never met a Jewish person. I grew up in New York in an area that had a lot of Jews. So when I moved to Pennsylvania, to Bucks County, there's actually very few here. And I remember the first time somebody, like a very nice person who didn't know that they were doing anything weird, use the expression Jewing somebody down. And I literally had never heard that expression. It came from ignorance. So I think there's a lot of that. And then when encouraged by domestic terrorists and foreign adversaries to find somebody to blame for whatever it is, whether it's the stress of your economic situation or dislike of a political result, you're going to target somebody who's a minority, and then look at, it's not like this is the only time this has happened. When you look at when Catholics first started running for office, like when JFK was running for president, people didn't want to support him, and there was all kinds of propaganda put out there that Catholics were going to do the bidding of the Pope rather than U.S. interests. I think there's similar. We have to acknowledge there's a similar role with Israel, right? People think that U.S. Jews might be more, committed to the interests of Israel than to the interests of the United States. I think it's a real factor.
This is like a dual loyalty, a risk of dual loyalty threat. Seth, other thoughts about this?
Well, I mean, we've seen this throughout history, right? Like, Jews are an easy target from any side of the aisle. For socialists, we are evil capitalists. For capitalists, we are evil socialists. So it's an easy way to just have a target and then meld Jews into whatever you don't like. And I think we've seen it all over the world throughout history, and I'm not sure that it'll ever end. It's just a matter of how we do the work to mitigate it and make it as little as possible.
Yeah, Jews as the universal boogeyman. All the more reason, perhaps, that we should focus on rebuilding trust in institutions and focus so strongly on strengthening democratic norms and institutions here, because the stability may be the counter force to the kinds of threats against Jews that show up when things get rocky. Okay, I want to shift a little bit away from that and talk a little bit about democratic norms and about the kinds of extremism we're seeing rising in new generations. We're seeing research that suggests that younger generations, particularly young millennials and Generation Z, are actually far more inclined to justify or turn to political violence as a way to achieve progress or change, seeing it as a legitimate tool of social change. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about how might we reverse that tide? Seth, do you have thoughts on this front?
I think that's the question of our time. Right now, our political environment is such that we need to really think through how can we change the direction. And I'm not saying that from a political or policy perspective, but from an overall environment. I mean, right now, there is so much violence in our communities. Unfortunately, as you said, we're recording this a few days after January 6th, and we just saw the attack in Minnesota and the violence there. And the younger generations have grown up in a very different environment than even I did as an older millennial. I grew up in the relative peace and norms of the 90s leading into 9/11. And then since then, we've seen financial crash in 2008, the results of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the current political environment and 2020 and everything since then, the pandemic. So I think it's going to take a lot of effort for us to reach out to people and build relationships, and it's going to be a slow process because none of us as elections officials or even just members of the community have the type of bully pulpit that people do who want to cause the distrust. So we're going to have to work harder and longer and more of a grassroots way to build those relationships back up.
Yeah. And model, I think, the kind of shared discourse, cross-ideological, cross-partisan conversation we're having right here, right now. Kathy, how about you? Oh.
As I said earlier, right, these things, these 24/7, 365 super highways of information includes a whole lot of false information and bad information, and of course the younger generation is using it even more than anybody else, right? So and I think I can't remember what the percentage is, something like 80% of Americans are getting their news from phones at this point. And when you look at social media and the algorithms and the echo chambers, and you combine all those things, and particularly, when you talk about millennials and young people who the percentage, the number of sheer hours that they spend on their phones is just enormous. Of course, they're going to be influenced by all that, in a more extreme way than people who are seeing it less. So I think, unfortunately, what we've seen in the last year, well, I should say the last couple of years, is that we were making strides with like social media platforms, being willing to hear about false and threatening information, on their sites, and they would accept reports and they would flag them and take them down and so forth. But of course, there was the attack on that. And so the platforms have all taken a step back. The federal government has also, of course, taken many steps back. So there's, when I often talk about disinformation, which is only a part of what we're talking about here, but it's related. There's there's billions of different pathways for bad information, for false information, for expressions of violence. We need just as many vectors to combat it. So happy to, I don't want to over answer that question because I hope that we'll talk more about some of the solutions that I think would help.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. And we're gonna come to that. We're gonna come to solutions in a minute. I'm actually thinking I love that analogy of millions or billions of ways that mis and disinformation can spread, and we need as many responses. And I'm thinking about how, as the father of 3 Gen Z kids, who I feel very proud to say are not on social media, right, but still show up at our dinner table sharing things that are patently untrue that they've heard about from their friends who've gotten them from their social media feeds. And like, my dining room table is one of those billions of vectors for countering disinformation. And that's a job I didn't feel like my dining room table needed to have, but it's maybe the job that all of our dining room tables need to have.
100%,
Yeah.
1,000%.
Yeah. More Perfect Union, we often say that we're nonpartisan, but we're not neutral, right? We are very comfortable calling out anti-democratic conduct, anti-democratic speech, illiberal expression, regardless of where it shows up on the ideological and partisan spectrum, particularly when it comes to violence. And I'm curious about how each of you see that distinction between being nonpartisan but not neutral show up in your professional work and in your lives. Seth, I'll go to you first on this one.
Well, I mean, for me, it's the heart of why I do this work. I served as deputy commissioner for 10 years for my former boss, City Commissioner Al Schmidt, who's now the Secretary of the Commonwealth in Pennsylvania. And we are the Republican commissioners in Philadelphia on the Board of Elections. So it is our job to make sure our elections are being run well and run fairly, and then defend the integrity of the work that we've done, and to make sure that every single Philadelphian is able to have their voice heard. And that should not be a Democratic value or a Republican value. It's an American value and a Jewish value. And we took that very seriously. And that is why in 2020, when there were threats against elections officials and against the election itself, we stood up and took that on head on. So, we were nonpartisan in our work, and we were not neutral about where we stood. And we're continuing to do that. It's why when my boss left office and the mayor was looking to appoint his replacement, the first question I was asked in the interview was, why would you want to do this? You just went through the 2020 election, received death threats. You had to have police stationed outside of your house to protect your family. Why would you want to continue in this role? And it's for that very reason that we cannot be neutral when it comes to the truth. And it doesn't matter whether it's coming from the left or the right, we have to stand up for the truth and for democracy and for making sure that every single person has value and that their views are able to be heard when they go to the ballot box.
Thank you. Kathy.
I love Seth. This is right. I mean, so I just, working with Seth has just, when Al was leaving the position, I was so happy when Seth was the person that was nominated, or and that Seth was willing to do this, because he is everything that a city commissioner in Philadelphia should be. So thank you, Seth, for your service.
Thank you, Kathy.
I just want to say, I guess, I echo everything Seth said, and I'll just add, I agree that, look, Tikkun Olam, right, it says it all, right? Heal the world. And I think it's not a partisan, all this stuff that we're talking about, none of it is partisan, right? This is about, we're now in 2026, right? It's the 250th anniversary of our nation. We have managed to survive and thrive amidst many differences, many different nationalities, to get to this 250th year. And that's a huge accomplishment. But I wanna build towards the next 250 years. And Tikkun Olam says, right, we need to heal the world. We need to work together to build forward so that all of us can live in peace and harmony together. And unless we have these conversations, we're not going to do that.
That's great. Also, not only that, but it'll also be easier to say quincentennial than semi-quincentennial, right? We should all be so lucky that that's the vocabulary word we need to learn. Okay, so let's talk about solutions. Um, what are some concrete ways that leaders, especially Jewish communal leaders, right, rabbis, heads of Jewish communal institutions, can take to help lower the temperature in their communities right now? Kathy, I'll go to you first on this.
How much time do you have?
I got all the time.
As I said, we need a million different vectors. And, one of the things that we know more than anything else is that proximity builds trust, right? Again and again and again, though people, yes, they get a lot of their information from the phone and they don't know a lot of the people that they're listening to. In order to combat those forces, the strongest element we have is community, is local trusted voices. And that's rabbis, that's also your neighbor, right? And so that's part of the problem of the phones, is that they've served to isolate people rather than bring people together. And what we need is your dinner table, right? The more conversations that we are having, and I don't care where we have these conversations. It can be in temple, it could be in the community center, in the library, or on phones. The more we're talking about this stuff in a productive way, the better. And you look at, you mentioned de-escalation. We've also talked about things not being partisan. So, for example, if you look at, the National Governors Association, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, or now maybe it was 2 years ago, started something called Disagree Better. They would have a Republican governor and a Democratic governor saying, we basically disagree about everything, but what we can agree on is, and a lot of times the conversations had to do with elections or run fairly, lots of different things that you could go for. Like, those things need to be talked about, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's about our elections being fair, all the many things flying in our world right now. We need to be able to talk about them in respectful ways. And the NGA effort really kind of kicked that off. We need to be replicating that on the local level and across the country. And I also just want to say, you mentioned some data on people's willingness to use violence, tolerance of it. Even last year, there was an NPR and poll that said 30% of our population said that violence may be necessary to get the country back on track. And to both of your points, a lot of those comments are not held just by one party, right? I mean, I can't believe how many people are willing to say things, post things on social media about wishing somebody, whoever they don't agree with, should be assassinated, or comments about attempted assassinations. I mean, so what our leaders need to do, is never ever do that themselves, which I shouldn't even have to say, but the truth is we have to say it. But they also have an obligation that when their constituents or friends or colleagues are saying that stuff, we can never, ever normalize or legitimize those statements. We need to call them out. I don't care how I feel about any person. I will never, ever condone somebody saying that person should be assassinated. And we should hold our leaders accountable for that. They need to be speaking out about this stuff, and instead, a lot of them are fueling it.
Yeah. One of the things that we wrestle with all the time is we want people to lean into the hard conversations, whether that's about anti-Semitism or about abortion or about tax policy or national security or immigration, right? The places where there's heat. And as you said, we wanted them to do it in a productive way. And those issues for a lot of Americans, a lot of Jewish Americans, but a lot of Americans in general feel existential, right? They feel very scary. And part of the dynamic in a highly toxically polarized world is that the fear of how bad things will get if my side loses, my perspective is not represented, feels really scary. And I think that lends itself to the, oh my God, I'm willing to consider, right, by any means necessary, because of how frightened I am about the potential loss. So again, Seth, I'll go to you. How can Jewish community leaders navigate that duality? The stakes are very high, and we need to not take them. We need to not add fuel to the fire of those stakes.
I think it starts with seeing people as people. Start with not viewing the issue that you're going to be debating or the topic that is animating you, but start by looking at the person across the aisle, across the table from you, as another person. And when you do that, it changes how you see the conversation. And you can also do that by volunteering as a poll worker. I think that's one of the things we can really see from our leaders is the more you get involved and see our elections and our democracy up front in person, the better off we will all be. Because in most places, almost everywhere, no matter where you live, there's going to be people who live in your neighborhood, who vote at your precinct, who don't see things exactly the way you do. And when you are working as a poll worker and making sure that they're able to participate, no matter who they are, and you greet them in the morning and they greet you and you see them bring their kids to the polling place, they become more of a real person to you. And that's the most important first step. Because for me, one of the Jewish values that's so important is the value of life, the value of human life, and what we need to do to preserve that. And, I always go back to this example of during the pandemic, and in 2020, during the primary in the spring, when the pandemic just first started, people were really scared, right? They wanted to participate in their primaries in a really important presidential election where, yes, all of these different issues came up that were existential in many people's minds. But most importantly for me was, how can I make it so that they can participate? So when I'm collecting ballots outside of a drop box, and people are doing it as like a drive-by, as a drive-through, so they don't have to interact with somebody, and everyone has masks on, and they're scared. But when you can see the gratitude on their face that you made it possible for them to have their ballot get counted, or when somebody has, whether it's a firefighter or a nurse, has a 12 or longer hour shift, and they can't get to the polls on election day, and you were able to help them get their ballot cast, and you know how grateful they are. That, to me, was the most important experience that I had in 2020. And taking that experience, and as leaders, whether it's in the Jewish community or elsewhere, and demonstrating that, and then encouraging your members or your community to also participate, I think that's how we get through this.
I mean, I love that. I love both of those answers, honestly. And I feel like both of you invoked Jewish values, right? Like a commitment to life, pikuach nefesh, like saving a life as being one of the most important values that Jews have, and tikkun olam, Kathy, the obligation to repair the world. And I feel like between you almost laid out like a three-part formula for how we can do that kind of repair, right? Build relationships and see the people across from you as as fellow human beings, so that the relationship comes first, and do that through service, right? If it's poll working, volunteering, things like that. Kathy, you talked about how important it is to have hard conversations respectfully. And then Kathy, you also talked about holding people accountable when they go off the rails and start to endorse or legitimize things that are really not acceptable and dangerous to a democracy, things like political violence. I want to close with a last question for both of you. As we talked about at the beginning, we're headed into another highly charged election cycle. What should Jewish leaders be watching out for in their communities? What are some of the early warning signs that rhetoric and polarization are tipping towards something more dangerous? And what can they do to intervene early? Seth, I'm going to go to you first, and then Kathy, I'll give you the last word.
It's a good question. I think it starts with vigilance. It starts with just keeping an eye on what's happening in the news. I mean, we're pretty early in the cycle right now, but it's going to heat up fast. From a Philadelphia perspective, locally, we don't have too much going on. So I am hopeful that at least from our local jurisdiction's perspective, it won't heat up to that degree, but that isn't going to be the case everywhere. So I think it starts with keeping an eye on the news, knowing what's going on in your community, and then just talking to people. It's checking in with your members, with your community members, and making sure that they feel comfortable and safe, and ask them what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. And if we do that and we check in with each other, then we can all, watch out for each other and try and steer this thing back onto the right track.
Kathy?
I love that. Well, I think, Aaron, one of the other values is community, right? Jewish value, not just Jewish value, but certainly a Jewish value. And I feel like the value of community here is both a good way to have an early warning signal and also a way to do what we were just talking about before with getting information, accurate information out, right? And I think so, and of course, rabbis and Jewish communities of all kinds are in a good position to be. We like to talk to each other, like we always have, we always will. I'm a Jewish mother, I care about my own family, and I'm also play that role in other people, with the people that I love and live alongside. And so, let's do that. Let's be hearing. Look, we talk to our kids, right? Like, as we were talking about, we know that they're on social media even more than the rest of us. Get them talking about what they're seeing and hearing. That's often a very good early warning signal. Encouraging them to have debate, to have conversations respectfully, as we talked about. I feel like, back to what I said a couple of questions ago, trust is built through proximity.
Yeah.
And so, let's use that community to really both understand where the fault lines are and also build out to strengthen those lines. And we can do that together, but it's going to take all of us.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, we talk about states as the laboratories of democracy. I think local communities, maybe even more so civil society institutions where people are members and are working through the challenges of being in community together. Those things function that same way. And I really appreciate that what both of you said about Jewish leaders' roles as listeners and as communicators, right? They can be vectors for trusted information around elections because trust, even though trust is eroding, it's an inverse relationship to proximity. The closer you are to your local community leader, your rabbi, your clergy person, the more trust there is there to share information. I think that's really valuable. I want to close by returning to where we started, with responsibility, but also with hope. Jewish history gives us every reason to take political violence very seriously. But Jewish tradition also insists that we're not powerless, and in fact that leaning hard into healthy political conflict is an essential part of sustaining the diverse nation that we are building together. Political violence is not inevitable. It's not representative of what most Americans are, and it's not compatible with the democratic values that have allowed Jewish life to flourish in this country. For those watching, we hope you leave this conversation with three things. First, practical tools for de-escalation, language, posture, and habits that can help calm rather than inflame. Second, a renewed commitment to the democracy principles that a more perfect union espouses, especially our shared rejection of political violence and dehumanization. If you want to learn more about those, we encourage you to visit democracyprinciples.org. And third, a sense of responsibility to talk with your stakeholders, boards, staff, congregants, members, partners, about how we lower the temperature together and spot risks early as this election year unfolds. Democracy isn't something we have, it's something we do. And in moments like this, choosing restraint, courage, and respectful pluralism is in itself an act of leadership. Thank you, Kathy and Seth, for your leadership, for your partnership, and for your public service. And to everyone watching, for the work you do every day to strengthen democracy in your own communities. Thanks very much.